Welcome to Questions We're Afraid to Ask.
All right, welcome back, everyone. So Bill had the idea. Let's talk about mental health today, which I like, and I figured we would start with real quick. I just read Bad Therapy by Abigail Shrier, who was on Rogan a week ago. At this point, it would be a month ago. Or so. And so I actually got the audiobook, plowed through it. It was really interesting. And so I want to just figure we'll start there and then see where that takes us. What I found really interesting in this is she talks about this idea of called iatrogenesis, which was not a word I'd heard before, but it's when the healer harms the patient. And I think really the idea is that like everything has side effects. Tylenol has side effects. Like everything, anytime food can have side effects. There's side effects in everything, and
nothing exists in a vacuum. Everything has an effect.
And so she's looking at the harms that can come from talk therapy, and she in the very beginning very clearly says, like, look, there are absolutely instances where children should be in talk therapy. The extreme example of like a family member being murdered in front of them is a wildly traumatic incident that but grandma dying of cancer shouldn't require talk therapy. And that's sort of the idea that she's getting into is, are we actually by engaging in this high level of self-assessment and all the things that we sort of talk about at such a high level, does that initiate things? And she references the DARE program, like coming in and doing this and having these conversations sort of let people know that it made it less of a taboo, I guess.
Well, I remember the DARE program. Like, I remember when that launched. So two things. One, I haven't read her book, but I watched her interview, and she was very clear to say there is good and necessary therapy, and there are good and necessary therapists. Because I know that's one of her big critiques is this woman just hates therapy, and that is not what she was saying.
No.
She kind of comes down on therapy the same way I come down on ADD and hyperactivity meds. I think they're massively overdone and overprescribed. Yeah. And we jump to it too fast, right?
Yes.
Doesn't mean they're not necessary in specific circumstances. But so I remember the DARE program, and I never really thought about drugs as a kid at that age in elementary school. But then I started thinking about drugs, and there was a very supposed to be powerful commercial that came out when I was about 4th grade. And it's the famous egg cracking commercial for the DARE program. This is your brain, and then they crack it and fry it, and this is your brain on drugs. And I went, that's funny, right? It didn't have. I thought it was funny. I thought it was a gag, right? And
the same argument was made about the original, Reefer Madness whole thing, which was like there were these ads saying, hey, if you do this thing, it's going to be terrible and you're going to go crazy. And they'll go like, yeah, but John smokes weed and he's fine. So, and so like, obviously you're lying to me,
at the same time that we also had the Satanic Panic, which I never saw any evidence from, but it was always somebody who knew somebody who knew somebody who knew somebody or some rumor. And the really bad Dungeons and Dragons makes you a serial killer movie starring Tom Hanks. And Dungeons and Dragons was satanic and all that. And I'm like, no, we're trying to like take the video games we're playing with the like boots that protect you from lava and make it into a game, and we're rolling dice. You obviously have no idea what we were doing.
We had the same thing with Magic cards at school. We got told the same thing. So, but what she gets into is some of the things that some of the poor outcomes that come from this thing. So I've got it pulled up here. So like, people sort of rearrange their self-understanding. It can encourage family estrangement. It causes marital stress, compromises patient resilience. It can make you more traumatized, more depressed, undermine your self-efficacy. So it makes you less able to turn your life around. Yeah, and that's just some of the. And so what I found I would say it's totally worth your time if you're interested in that stuff, especially if you have kids that you're thinking about that might need therapy. It's definitely worth a read. It's some good information. Whether or not it's right or not, you decide on your own. But like, there's some what and where I was going with this is what I found interesting is reading through this, having done a lot of therapy as a kid for regular therapy, as well as I did a lot of therapy sort of stuff because I have ADD. It's my parents put me into different programs, and I identified with a lot of this of like, oh yeah, very true. I do remember feeling that way. And one thing they called out that I spoke to me was the idea of like having a bad thing happen to you and you logging it and going, I better remember that for therapy later. Like, where you might just dismiss it normally, and that it makes you sort of log and classify those things.
You're just a little bit younger than I am, and I think you got caught in the therapy generation at the beginning of that wave. Whereas the 5-year difference, sometimes it's drastic how half a decade can be, right? Now, some of this may also be both of your parents were college educated, and both of them came from a very different background than my parents did, right? My dad was a blue collar guy. My mom worked in the school system, but without a college degree. And we didn't not deal with things, but there were things that you just got over and you dealt with it, right? And that was the thing. That was that thing. It's that Gen X mentality of shit happens, crap happens. And I've actually had parents look at me aghast when my son has come up and been like, "This is bad. I don't like it. It's not fair." And I'm like, "Yeah, life sucks. Deal with it." Yeah. And I've had parents who are just like, "How could you say?" I'm like, "I'm preparing my kid for the real world. How can I not tell him that shitty things happened?" I mean, I love the way Star Trek said it. Like, you can do everything right and still lose.
Yeah.
You know. But one point I want to make, real quick, one point I want to make is we also have to be very careful that there are very different types of therapy, right? Because even though I'm not a huge therapy person, my oldest son has been in therapy for years because he's high functioning autistic. I've talked about it, but his therapies are very focused and directed. Like a lot of his therapy right now, and I've asked his permission if I could talk about this stuff, in case anybody's wondering, are dealing with like executive functioning, right? And what do I mean by executive functioning? How does he process the way a neurotypical person would, the way the world works, because his brain doesn't work that way. So it's not so much therapy, like how did it make you feel? It's more like training and accountability with a focused purpose, right?
Yeah.
Because it was kind of ironic. I had just watched the interview with the author, and then I was talking to his therapist because we were doing like a checkup thing, and I was like, "Yeah, this author, they said this thing, and that kids are getting too much therapy and they're over they're over therapied." And she was like, "You're absolutely right. That is a huge problem." And this is from someone who makes their living doing it, right? And one of the things that really stood out to me is not just from her, but some of the other people that Rogan has had on that deal with like psychotherapy and stuff. It's like therapy needs to have a point. Like, we're going to meet for X number of sessions and this is our goal, right?
And that's a big piece that she talks about in this, is that, it would be, she sort of goes, think about it in any other context. And I think she said this on Rogan too, but like, if you went to a doctor and they were like, all right, well, let's just say every Thursday forever, you'd be like, what do you mean forever? Like, why is there no end to this? And so she was commenting that if you go to a therapist and there's not a conversation in the first session about how many sessions there's going to be, that you might want to, and again, she's not to disparage, but she just sort of says like that should be a flag to you that that should be, or at least you should initiate that conversation.
And there's a great pop culture example of this right now. You really need to watch Resident Alien. If y'all haven't watched Resident Alien, it's hilarious. But the premise is the main character gets stuck as the town doctor, and that also includes therapy. And one of the characters has a regular weekly session where he goes to the therapy thing, and then the main alien character just basically ignores him. And I'm trying to do this as non-spoilery as possible. But the guy has all the neuroses, never gets any better, and just constantly focuses on all the bad crap going on it. And it's just a constant spin cycle. And it's like, that's the bad kind of therapy, where all you do is just always constantly talk about your problems. You're always terrified of everything. You're the scared person in your relationship. You're even afraid to have a conversation with your spouse because, of how they might potentially react. So you just don't do anything. And then come to find out that the person has some underlying trauma or whatever that's legit and real, but they're not doing the right kind of therapy to get at that and deal with it.
Yeah.
Right. It's just the general sit on the couch and talk about your problems, and the Freudian style of, well, everything is your mother and sex, right? That's but we're also talking about how the human brain works, and we really don't freaking know, right? That's the other aspect of this.
I want to hit one other point before we dip out of the book here.
Sure.
The last thing I wanted to mention that's sort of the second half to her book is she gets into the idea of social emotional education. And how some of these ideas and therapy methods and therapy words and the ideas of dealing with things emotionally and social emotional, and how that's not good for kids. And, she goes into a bunch of examples that I'll kind of ping on real quick. She goes over a whole bunch of things about testing in middle and high school and she reads questions where you're just like, have you ever thought about cutting yourself? And how have you thought about doing this? And have you thought about that? And when did you start having sex? And it's, setting these really low ages on things and questions that she mentions that one school shouldn't be able to ask students, that they're not able to ask students directly because it can't go into their file, but somehow because they've anonymized the questionnaires, now it's to a study. And but she just gets into the thing of like, well, if the book says, if the first option for when did you start having sex is 8, well, then maybe that's kids would just assume that's an appropriate age to do that. I
guess I should have been doing it by that point.
Right. And so she gets into some of that, and that's really interesting. And the other piece she gets into is sort of, it sounds like she's talking about with probably elementary school age kids, where they come in and sit in a circle and how are you feeling today? And how are you feeling today? And talking about the sort of the pitfalls of that of, if every kid, most kids don't want to be at school. So why bring it up at the beginning of the day and set the mood of that? And sometimes kids don't want to talk. And she uses a very specific example of teachers asking those sorts of questions to a woman who had adopted 2 kids out of a bad place, and they were in therapy for the things that they needed, and that the teacher prodding them for questions was actually the opposite of what they needed to be doing from the actual therapist's direction.
It's kind of like picking a scab.
Yeah, but also she gets into the fact that we're asking teachers, we're delivering education to these teachers saying these are the things that you should be doing. They're not prepared to deal with some of the outcomes of some of those questions. And she calls that a specific example of a teacher sort of pushing the student to talk, and the student ends with like, well, my dad died this last night, and this thing happened, and this, and then another kid, and then all of a sudden all the kids are upset and crying, and it's time for math. And how does the teacher's not prepared to do that, and that's not and then one last example that she gets into is that this is something that we've talked about in education as well, and I sort of am seeing this a lot, where we're not accounting for the 5, and this is an extreme, but the 5% of sociopaths of people who figure out that there's a system and here's how I can navigate this system to get away with things I shouldn't be able to get away with because, if all I have to do is get in the circle and apologize to the kid that I did the terrible thing to, then I don't get in trouble. But what you're also doing then is re-traumatizing the kid who got picked on, making them apologize to their attacker. That somehow that makes it better, and so I'm really
and I don't want to go
summarizing.
down that rabbit hole because we'll change the topic completely. But
right, but the whole idea is there are these social emotional pieces that are being added, and her concern is not all of them, but a lot of the things that are being implemented may actually be counterintuitive to the objectives and could actually be causing more problems in there. That her argument is that they definitely are causing more problems than they're helping. So
and we get into mental health. We're talking about mental health, and there's a lot of aspects to mental health. It's new, and it's not new. So modern psychology is still relatively in its infancy and new. So we're still learning a lot of things, and we can get into it or not, but you went through something when you were younger that was bad therapy. Everyone agrees now that it was bad therapy, and we don't have to get into the gory details unless you decide to. But we wouldn't know that unless someone had a theory about it, a hypothesis, and then we tried it, and then it didn't work, and it blew up, and now we need to go in and fix it. And that is the dark side and necessary side of medicine, right? We do have to try things to see if they work. But we had other things that were therapy before. And it used to be the pastor, right? Or the spiritual leader, or the nobleman, not nobleman, the clan elder, or the shaman, or the wise people that you would go to, or your mentor, or there were groups that you could go, or individuals you could go to and talk about these things in what we now call a safe space. And it worked to a point. But the reason I'm getting to this is, I went through seminary, and one of the things we had to study in there was there is a very, very clear difference between what I do as a pastor, which is spiritual counseling, versus therapy. And the classes we took were to draw that line when we knew we needed to refer to a professional. Now, a lot of that was to protect us for our own legal liability, right? Which is not the best way to look at it, but we're in a litigious society, and so it's necessary. But as a pastor, much like an educator, you're a generalist. You deal with a lot of stuff that you're not necessarily trained on. And you should direct to professionals and not try and meddle in things that are you're not an expert in, right? So it's hard for elementary teachers because there's so much gen ed there. They cover so many things. But when you start getting into like the junior high and the high school, then we're talking about like, I don't need my history or my math teacher to try and psychoanalyze me. And I'm not trying to pick on teachers. That is not the point of what I'm trying to do here. If I'm going to pick on anybody, it's going to be the school counselors. And I know lots of amazing school counselors. But a school counselor's job isn't to counsel people therapeutically. It's to help them move forward in their career goals, right?
And it seems like that role has shifted from.
But the job description hasn't. I looked it
up. So I want to tag another thing that you were mentioning, all the people that you had for therapists, and one of the things that Abigail Shrier mentioned was that kids used to have the friend group that they would talk to, and now they don't. They talk to their therapist instead of their friend. And she goes through a whole big thing about like your therapist isn't going to come when you're pregnant, and isn't going to come to your wedding shower, and isn't going to be your bridesmaid. Like that we're taking some of that friendship stuff away, that if you don't have that friend that you tell all your secrets to, that there's something's lost there. The other thing I wanted to mention as well, as you were talking about going to professionals, just to tag this on here, Abigail mentions this as well. There's not really an oversight. If if you go have surgery done and someone nicks your liver while they're in there, there's a process to go through, and there's an oversight committee for malpractice and all these things. But if you go to a doctor and they convince you that, I want to use something not controversial, if they somehow convince you that you have false memories and that all these terrible things happened to you in your childhood that you've forgotten, there's not a malpractice suit that you can take against. If you believe it and you ruin your life because of it, and then you realize what's happened and you're like, whoa, wait a minute, how did I get convinced of this thing?
As opposed to, and I'm going to use a non-controversial example, someone who does surgery on you but leaves a clamp inside you and sews you up, you can sue them for malpractice, right? Because
people get sponges left in them all the time.
And there's a reason they inventory after surgery, right? To make sure that doesn't happen. But there's also an oversight board because of it, right? We treat mental health so differently than we do body health.
Yeah.
But they're tied together.
Doctors have to carry malpractice insurance for a reason, because things happen. Even with nobody messes up, things get left and accidents happen. But why don't we have that with mental health, and why do we look at it so? Here's my thought on this. I think part of the reason that we look at it so differently is that, at least with the body, mechanically we kind of understand it. With the brain, it's and understanding how thought and consciousness and depression and all that, it's so esoteric still. We haven't nailed down the mechanisms behind it. It's harder to.
We also,
I don't know.
I also want to throw this out there. We haven't had a few events to help us understand mental trauma and how to repair it and how to help with it the way we have with the physical body. And what do I mean by that? We had the U.S. Civil War, we had World War I, and then we had all the horrible experiments that were done by the Axis powers in World War II, and all the injuries we learned how to treat because of World War II. And the dirty little secret of science is, like, we used a lot of that research to push medicine forward, even though it was a horrible thing that should never have happened, right? So that pushed body physical medicine research forward faster, or at least it helped contribute to it. Now, those events also did massive amounts of mental trauma. and I want to speak on this specifically because I just finished Masters of the Air and the documentary about it, which is exceptional. And while I love Saving Private Ryan, I love Band of Brothers. I watch it once a year. The Pacific was really good. This one struck a powerful chord for me because my grandfather was a B-17 gunner, right? Primarily a tail gunner, but he did several jobs. And after I finished it, I went and found and reread his obituary. And one of the lines in the obituary, because not only was he that, he was shot down, he was captured, he was a POW, he had to do the march between all the camps, which all of this is in that series. It's covered in that series in part. Like the main characters, like he did everything they did, right? And one of the lines in his obituary is, he was never able to leave the trauma of the war behind. And he died at 93. Now, a magical thing happened when he was in his late 70s, early 80s. He had a massive stroke. And he lost a lot of functionality, and he wasn't able to fully function on his own anymore. But something changed in his brain when that happened. And he started to smile again, like really smile. He still remembered all the stuff, but whatever happened in the stroke disassociated the night terrors. He stopped having night terrors after the stroke. He was able to enjoy the day-to-day aspects of life. He was happy because I grew up with my grandpa being a very stern, very distant, very cold man. Not a bad man. I want to make that very clear. He wasn't a bad man. He went out of his way to be a good person. And he was a workaholic. Cold. Well, he was cold. He was distant. He was a workaholic. He couldn't stop. he held on average 3 jobs at any given point, not because he needed them. Like he was a school teacher, a volunteer firefighter, and a reserve police officer in Harris County for like 30 years. He did all 3 of those at the same time, 2 of which he did for free. But it was the work that kept him away from the mental torture that he never fully addressed.
Yeah. We know how important a purpose is. I mean, that's
Yes.
one of those things of like when someone retires, if they don't have
they die.
a purpose, people die. Yeah.
Yeah.
I also think that's why a lot of husbands and wives that have been together for so long, when one goes, the other one just sort of like, well, I don't really. A lot of times that can happen.
It's also a reason that a lot of husbands and wives who have kids but don't work on their marriage throughout the kids' lifetimes split up when the kids move out, because they're not the same people they were when they got together, and they didn't maintain the relationship because they were so busy being parents that they stopped dating and doing those kind of things. Yeah. Not everybody, but it happens. It's a high percentage that happens to.
Yeah.
But all this revolves around the fact that we're still figuring this stuff out, right? And I've gone to therapy for a variety of years, and something changed for me recently. About 8 weeks ago, I've been going through a long, drawn-out legal process with custody stuff and all that, and it honestly, it's been 18 months since it ended. But the judge's final signature on the paperwork, it took 18 months from the end of it till the judge signed the paper. And I'm not going to get into any of the details. That's nobody's business. But I thought I had dealt with it, and I had let most of the weight go, because 18 months ago, when all the legal stuff ended, most of the weight went away. But then I get the email that it's over, it's done, here's the paper with a signature. And it felt like 10 tons lifted off. And like I talked to, I'm not going to get into work, but I talked to my boss the other day. He's like, yeah, I have noticed a massive change in you just in the last 6 or 8 weeks. You're more positive. You look like you have more energy. You're more interactive. You're more like the guy I knew before all this stuff happened. And I thought I had let it all go. But now this thing that has been hanging over me for years is gone, and I didn't even realize it. It's like that's how the brain works, right? You didn't even realize that you're carrying this weight, and sometimes you can be carrying a weight, and then something happens, and then it goes away. And now I have seen therapists throughout the whole process for a variety of reasons, because one work said you had to because I went out for a health issue, and that's part of how our where I work, that's how they do that. Just to make sure you're doing okay as you're, disassociated from the whole thing, which is actually great. It's a great thing. I like that they not only are they worried about your physical body, but they're worried about your mental state of mind, right? Which I think is the point. We should be looking at this holistically, right? Because I have seen good therapists be like, you need to get outside in the sun and exercise before we try drugs.
Yeah, well, that's something
I've also seen. Well, the flip side is I've also seen good psychiatrists and therapists go, "You're so far down a bad road. We need to put you on some drugs so we can get you to exercise." Right? You can be in both places. I don't want to discount either, but we need to be looking at this much more holistically, right?
Right. Well, I mean, this gets down to the whole. I mean, so again, I keep going back to the book because she brings up a lot of these same ideas, but kids need to get outside, and they need to have that freedom, and they need to go out and be engaging. Something else she actually mentions in that is stress on kids, and she actually specifically brings up observation. That apparently whenever they're studying kids, I think actually maybe anybody, but I think she specifically is talking about kids in this, that a way to artificially induce stress is to introduce an observer. so that someone that is watching you do the thing. It will just automatically introduce stress. And so what she's bringing up is the fact of like, we've strapped GPS trackers to all of our children and we're watching everything they do. And even though we don't realize it, the fact that they can't just leave the house and disappear for 4 hours stresses them out. It causes them anxiety that we're tracking their every move. Which I thought was interesting. There's a Black Mirror episode about that.
I want everybody who's listening to this who was born after 1990 to think about this. Imagine leaving home for the day and not contacting anyone that you know, love, and care about, or even thinking about trying to contact them or find out where they are until 6 o'clock at night when everyone shows back up at home. Imagine that.
Yeah.
That was my life growing up, right? That was the thing, because there wasn't a way to do it.
Yeah, there wasn't. We had to check in at lunch. That was the thing for us. Like, my parents' thing for me was like, well, I also was in the middle of the city and not the greatest neighborhood in the world at the time. Now it's a great neighborhood, but at the time it wasn't the greatest neighborhood in the world. And so I would leave the house at whatever, and it would sort of be like, in like 4 or 5 hours, come back, just be like, hey, I'm alive. Okay. And then I would,
and see,
so they would know to start looking if,
and mine was different in that, one, it was 5 years earlier.
Mm-hmm. And it was in the,
I was in the subdivision that when the subdivision ended, there was wood and cow pastures. Right. And the other part of that is, looking back, my mom was kind of the neighborhood mom, so we would be in and out and around. But there were 2 or 3 neighborhood moms, and at dinner time, if you weren't home, the neighborhood mom, whichever house it happened to be, would call the other parents and be like, "Hey, I'm sending the kids home."
Yeah,
or we get a phone call and be like, "Hey, is Bill there? Tell him he needs to come home." Right?
Yeah.
That kind of thing. But I'm even more talking about like early on when I got married, right? Cell phones were expensive, so we didn't have them, right? And I where I worked and where my ex-wife worked at the time, we couldn't call because they were both call centers, right? And so, like, we could call and leave a voicemail. That was bad. That was how old it was. We could call and leave a voicemail at the desk extension and be like, "Hey, I'm going to be late to pick you up," or, "Hey, this happened." But that was like when something went wrong was the only time that would happen. We didn't even think about calling people. We'd show up to people's house and knock on the door.
Yeah.
Just to see if they were there.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, I mean, I kept a bag of change in my backpack in high school for the payphone.
Yeah.
Like, if I needed, because at the time, my mom had a pager. Because and so if something came up, I could call her pager and
put the payphone number in and wait for a phone call at the payphone, right?
Right.
Or
collect calls. I remember when I used to have to collect call. Yeah.
I remember how world-changing the prepaid phone card was. But like when I was young, the way I would figure out where people were was I'd get on my bike and I'd ride around until I saw where all the bikes were parked. And that's how we knew where everybody was, right? And all of this deals with like free range stuff. And getting back to the mental health aspect, I knew that I was raising my kids somewhat differently when my oldest son, and I want to use this example because this is one of the examples that came out of the book and out of the thing, is like, when your cat dies, you shouldn't put your kid in therapy. That's over. Something bad has happened, and they need to address it. So, my oldest son absolutely loves animals. He loves cats the best, and he's had really bad luck with cats. Like when his first cat that he had only had for about slightly less than 2 years suddenly died. It got out of the house, ran across the street, got hit by a car, and killed. The way we dealt with that is I had him dig the hole and we buried the cat at the house.
Right.
And we had a little like mini funeral type thing for the cat. And we put a marker where the dead cat was. But I made him do it to deal with loss of life and grief in 6th grade. And I have told many other parents that, and they think I'm a monster.
Yeah. No, it doesn't
And
seem...
I'm like, no, shit happens. And you have to deal with that crap.
Right.
And it is my job as a parent not to be my kid's friend. Not even, they don't have to like me. My job as a parent is to prepare them for the day I'm not there to help them. Right?
Mm-hmm.
To be functional in this world. And I've had drag out arguments with my kid where he's like, you don't like me. You don't, you're not nice to me. And I'm like, it's not my job to do any of those things. It's my job to get you ready to deal with this world that is going nuts.
That's true.
We've gotten a little off topic here, but it all ties back into this. Like, I don't want to cripple my child with too much mental health. Now, the other side of that is I've had that same child in therapy since 8th grade because he's autistic and he needed assistance. But it's a very focused and functional type of therapy with a specific goal. And there have been periods where the therapist has said, we're good and this can stop now.
Right.
If these things come back, then let's pick it up later on. Now, I have tried to keep the same therapists for continuity of care, which is another big thing I think is important. But I think you need a point. Like, I don't want to. And some medicines hook us in. Like, I take allergy shots now. It's awesome, but I'll be taking allergy shots the rest of my life because it fixes it, but it's not a cure.
Yeah,
they're treating the symptom. They're treating the symptom. They're not curing the problem because they don't know how.
I'm gonna willingly slide off mental health here for a second and move on to just general health here. Let's talk about Ozempic for a second, because that what you're talking about totally.
I just did it.
What's that?
I just did the whole Ozempic thing, right? I just tried it. Yeah.
So I want. There was a guy on Tucker Carlson a month or two ago talking about Ozempic, and I've looked into it a little bit. I know you tried it. I'll let you talk about your experience if you want to.
Let's first define what it is intended for. Like what it was designed for, right?
So
not
Ozempic,
what it's being used for.
Yeah, Ozempic was designed as a drug for diabetes. What it actually
specifically type 2 diabetes.
Yes.
Where other medications aren't controlling the problem.
Right. So what it appears to do, and let's just preface the fact that I'm not a doctor and I'm going to repeat the things that I heard smarter people than me say on the internet.
Okay. Fair enough.
Or maybe they're not smarter than me, but I'm going to repeat the things that I heard the people say on the internet. Okay, so what he was explaining was that, and this is what I've heard from other places as well, is that essentially it is inducing stomach paralysis. Mm-hmm. That essentially what it's able to do is to sort of shut down your stomach's response to food, to hunger, but it also triggers the hunger receptors in your brain and turns those off as well. So not only does it turn off your stomach, it's also, because I'm sure they're connected in some way, and so that's what's happening. And so there's a couple of things he talks about. One is this, this is now it's being used off label for weight treatment.
Yeah.
And his argument is, one, why are we treating the problem with drugs when we should be looking at what we're eating and the medical system as a whole and that whole thing?
Well, but the other side of diet and all that stuff, and just poor discipline and not exercising and all that stuff. Right. Absolutely.
But then he also talks about how it's problematic. There's already potential lawsuits in process, I think, and that some people are having issues, lots of side effects, but then also things where people develop stomach paralysis and then they stop taking it and it doesn't go away. Like it sticks around. Like they've essentially broken something in some way. And maybe it will fix itself over time. But so it's I forget what you said that made me think about that, but it's the holistic thing. We're
Holistic
we're
health. Holistic
we're
health. Yeah.
going, you're overweight. So let me give you the pill. It's not a pill, but whatever, the pill to fix that here, rather than going like, well, you're eating like shit and you're not sleeping and you don't exercise, and why don't we address these other things before we implement the thing, you know? I'm sure there are doctors out there who are doing that, but there's also who push those things first and are not doing this. But I think there's also the standpoint of like, I'm sure you get people coming in, you know, saying I'm doing all those things, or I don't want to do those things, and they just, I want the button, I want the
So
Jetsons button to push this to fix the problem.
let's use me as an example, because
Go for it.
I've gone through this recently, right?
Right.
So, now to give some background, there is massive evidence that diabetes is a genetic thing, as much as it is a bad habit thing, right? You can end up
Right.
diabetic through bad habits, but you can also do everything right and end up diabetic. Now, I wasn't doing everything right, but the history of diabetes in my family goes back as far as we can trace it, right? On both sides. So I was playing against a loaded deck, right? But I didn't eat horrible, but I didn't eat good, right? And I didn't exercise enough. Now, I have been on for like the last couple of years trying to fix my own habits and get healthier.
Right.
Part of that has been trying to eat better, but it's not a cure-all, right? Because I'm eating better, but it's not perfect. But even while I was doing all that, like I was starting to exercise, I was eating better, and I was doing that, but my A1C was still going up. So it's like, all right, well, we're because my doctor's one of those good doctors who's like, get off your ass, exercise, and don't eat crap. So I changed my eating styles massively, but it's not perfect. And I'll be perfectly honest, I can't afford to do the perfect diet. I literally don't have enough money to do it. Thankfully, I work at a place where they make very inexpensive, healthy meals at lunch. And so 3 to 5 days a week, I have one super healthy meal, and I eat two relatively small, relatively well-balanced, healthy meals. And I have tried to cut a lot of the fast food and a lot of the sugar, and I've cut almost all the sodas out, and I cut all the diet fake sugars out. And while I did all of that stuff, my A1C kept going up. So my doctor put me on a medication, metformin, which has worked really well, but it is not controlling it perfectly. It did for a couple of years, but then it started to creep up, regardless of what I was doing. I could exercise. My doctor was like, all right, let's try this Ozempic. And we started very small, and you have to do a small dose and work your way up because there's side effects. Like the first time I took, because it's a shot, you do a shot once a week. And I took the first shot, and oh God, I was so nauseous for 48 hours. Just within 15 minutes of taking the shot, I was ready to puke with nothing in my system, right? And then that kind of went away.
Shutting down your stomach.
Well, that kind of went away after a couple of days. And then it reduced my appetite. I was eating less, and I lost weight. I lost like 25 pounds over like 5 or 6 weeks, slowly upping the dose, right? Slowly upping the dose. And then I kind of leveled out, and I was good for about 2.5 months, right? And this is the point where I think it is a good thing, because I don't want to just bash Ozempic, right? That is not my job. Because what it did is it taught me how much I needed to actually eat to maintain a healthy body weight. Because as Americans, our portions are insane. They are so big compared to the rest of the world. Just the sheer amount of calories per meal we take in.
Now,
let me.
Well, hang on. I want to
Okay.
just. You did say when you were taking it. I don't remember what with what point here, but I remember you saying like, I'm having to make myself
That
eat.
came later. That came a little bit later.
Okay.
So I had the initial thing. I lost a lot of the weight. Then I had about 2.5 months of like it worked the way they said it's supposed to work, where I was taking like a small plate, eating the lean cuisine sized portions of food,
Right.
like the what they say the person of my height and my weight should take in 3 times a day, right? And I was good. I could eat that without a problem. But then it started to get to the point where I had to make myself eat that much food because I knew I was never hungry anymore. And then my doctor wanted me to up the dose. And in the 2 or 3 weeks leading up to that, not only did I have to make myself eat, I couldn't because I was getting nauseous after 2 or 3 bites. Like if you've ever gone to a Thanksgiving meal or a feast or something like that and eaten so much food, you literally feel like you're going to go and puke. 2 bites from a salad. It didn't matter what it was. 2 bites of food, I'd get the saliva in my mouth. My body would be like, food, and it would hit my stomach, and then it'd want to come up. That was the feeling that I would have. And then I started having massive, massive cravings for candy. Sugar, specifically like Starbursts. Just sugar cubes. And I started putting sugar cubes in my mouth, because I wasn't getting the nutrition I needed anymore.
Right.
And my body was screaming, food. Oh, and I can't put much in my mouth. But I can put 5 Starbursts in my mouth. Right. And soda, like cravings like.
Well, you were craving energy.
Yeah,
you needed,
to the point where my body
really
was like,
fast.
Go kill the Starburst and the soda and eat it and put it in. And then I called my doctor because at the same time my doctor's like, all right, well, I want to check your stuff, but let's max you out because I was at half the dose I was supposed to be.
Right.
She goes, let's double the dose and then see where you're at in 6 months. And I called her about 2 days. I went and filled the prescription and I didn't take it. And I called her and said,
well, and it was right
stop.
about that. It was right about that time that I saw this interview we're talking about, and I called you and was like, "Hey, this is what this guy." I kind of went over it with you as well, and you were like, I was thinking about, and it sort of all at the same time.
And that led to me giving my doctor a call and being like, "Hey, this is happening," and she goes, "Stop it, just stop, and then we'll see what happens." Now, to be fair, I'm having to be very careful now, and I've been off it for about 3 months. Right? Thankfully, within a week, it all flushed out of my system and I've had no side effects, right?
That's good.
But for about 2 months, I felt full when I was back to eating the lean cuisine size portions, right? And I'm just using that as a measurement, right? Now I'm getting to the point where I'm I have to be careful not to eat more. Because I'm still hungry. The hunger's coming back because I'm used to eating more. But I've also been able to when I went off the Ozempic, I put on about 3 or 4 pounds. Some of that fluctuates with water weight during the day, but I say 3 pounds I put back on. But I've stayed where I was because I now know what I need to eat, and I'm eating smaller portions, and I know that I don't need more than that. All right, I'm good and I'm done. I've eaten it has kind of changed my body in a point because if I do go, I'm going to eat a little bit more. Now I start to feel nauseous. So I don't think that's from the Ozempic. I think that's because my stomach shrank, literally shrank, which does happen because I've done that through discipline in the past when I was younger and in better shape and all that kind of stuff. So I think there's a place for it, but like anything else, we have to be careful with it. So that's kind of my journey with Ozempic, and I've still got the pen sitting in the fridge. But I'm afraid to use it.
I wouldn't if it was me.
But it did teach me what I needed to know and show me what is actually healthy without me feeling like I'm starving for my body. Right.
Something else that was interesting that this guy brought up is that it's actually a European company, and it's not legal to sell this in Europe.
Which that's a red flag, right?
Yeah.
I don't care what the product is. If your company is based in a country, and your country's like, you can't do that here.
Yeah.
Let's use another one. TikTok.
Yeah.
China doesn't let TikTok run the way it does in the U.S. in China at all. That's not slander. That is fact. We know that. Like, TikTok feeds educational stuff, and it turns itself off for kids at a certain time of night, and then they can't do it. That's not how it functions here.
I don't know. I don't know why we can't do that.
That's a flag. I want to be very careful with it because it's still a very new medication. There's still a lot of research that needs to be done. And, you know, I'm learning even more about the fact that, like, when we test drugs, we don't necessarily test for safety. We just test to see if it's going to do what it does. It says it does.
We test for efficacy.
I've seen effective drugs in my life. Now, this is
probably safety tested, but
maybe. But I've seen stuff that was over the counter get pulled because they found out much later it was dangerous, right? There was an allergy medication that was out when I was in junior high called Tavist. It was like a miracle pill. For the first time in my life, I could breathe. And I used it for like 3 or 4 years, and then it vanished. And I asked the pharmacist, I was like, "What's wrong?" They're like, "It's making people have heart attacks."
Oh, good.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
But we didn't know that in the small test cases that we used, and when it was prescribed, it was such a small. It wasn't until it became an over-the-counter medication that it hit enough of the population they were able to correlate the data to, oh my God, this is causing heart attacks on people who shouldn't be having it, that it got pulled off the market.
So you are being generous there in the way that you're framing that, because we do know
I'm trying to assume positive intent.
The way that the way that the medical industry works, that let's say that they could make a new drug and they're going to test it for whatever, and they can run 7 studies and 6 of them don't show what they want and the 7th one does, and they just throw the 6 of them out that don't show and they pick the 7th. You know, so it's very possible that could have been something that they knew. I mean, who knows?
But I don't know. I don't know, but I'm just giving you my anecdotal experience with that medication, right?
There are examples of drugs that I can't pull names of. The one where they bribed the FDA guy. They did
fentanyl?
a whole. No, not fentanyl, but
fentanyl.
it's the.
Oh, the opioids, the whole opioid thing that Netflix just did the whole big series on.
The whole Sacklers thing. So, I mean, just that example alone. But I mean, we know there are examples of drugs that they've had to pay damages because they knew they were bad and they did it anyway.
Putting my tinfoil hat on, there are drugs that I think have been invented that have been buried, or things that we have discovered.
Oh, for sure.
That cure things that have been buried. And one of the big one my dad is always on is DMSO. And we need to do more reading and then do a whole episode on DMSO.
We do.
But that DMSO is basically a cure for cancer. I don't know if it is or not. Let me be very clear. I don't know if it is or not. I don't know if it's tangential or not. But I know it's now being used in cancer research again, right? And I know I've used it for stuff that it's not, that's off-label, and it's worked. And it's basically still only sold because it's like a horse rub, like a horse liniment. But it was used a lot in the 60s. And what's really interesting is, like, all the books that were published about it back then, you can't find. They're out of print and no one will print them again. My dad still has a couple of them in hardback, which is why I know they exist. So,
well, that's sort of the thing we've been talking about as far as the research we're doing on, you know, ancient civilizations and stuff. But that one specifically, that like there's a lot of stuff that's only in a book somewhere, you know, and that if you don't find that book, you wouldn't, because it's not on the internet. It's not out there.
Yeah,
so
we think of the internet as the storage place for all information, and it's amazing how much information is not on the internet and never made it to the internet. Not in a malicious way. It just never made it on the internet. Like, it was published somewhere, and it's been in a book somewhere, and I've got dozens of books here that I can look at right now that I know this stuff's not on the internet.
Right.
And I've started hunting for stuff that's like pre-1990. You know, I've started actively looking for those books at used bookstores now.
Well, and I mean, I'm just going to reach over here and grab this one just because it's sitting here on my desk. But, like, this is Chris Dunn's new book. This is brand new. None of this is on the internet.
Yeah.
You know, like, so, I mean, we're talking about old books, but also, like, I think it's a frame shift of, like, not everything is on the internet. And then
Yes. And we have a
just
generation or two of people who grew up thinking everything that I need is on the internet.
right.
Right.
I did too. I mean, and now see, and it's interesting because I grew up going to the library at least twice a month, if not more often, because we were really close to the big downtown Houston library, 4 stories. I just love that library; it's amazing. But we also had a public library that was around the corner from the school I went to, and we would go there sometimes because they had a really nice, and I would just, so, but like even all the things I got from books, I still just sort of defer to the internet, and we've sort of been it's sort of been this shift of like realizing, and that like I have to, if I want to know this, I need to read this book, but there's sort of
and I think of the internet differently. I still, at my core, when I think of the internet, I think of like the encyclopedia. That's what the internet is. It's just the current version of the encyclopedia.
Yeah, for sure.
But it's a different framing. Like, I know not all the information is in the encyclopedia because I grew up with a copy of the Encyclopedia Britannica. And for those who don't know what that is, that's when they put all of the stuff that you would think you could look up on the internet in books, marked A, B, C, D. And I remember doing research papers in junior high, high school, and even college a little bit, because the internet was still in its infancy in college, and writing a research paper and having to cite the encyclopedia, the particular brand of encyclopedia, and the year it was published. And if I got information wrong in the paper, but it was right in my source, then it was considered good and accurate, and I got a good grade. Because no one could afford to buy a new copy of the encyclopedia every year. In fact, it would usually take you a few years to get a whole set of the encyclopedia because they were expensive. Now that information gets published so fast that I just think, oh, I can look up the current version of this info now.
Right.
So to me, the internet is that, and the internet is my how-to guide. Like, I used to buy how to do it, fix it books. And I still like to get those because some of those, that information's not on the internet either, right? I've got some old like how to fix it books that talk about ripping apart like old electronics and things like that. That just, there's no point of putting that on the internet really because they're so archaic. Unless you're into a hobby like that, like rebuilding a VCR or tearing apart and rebuilding a video camera that takes VHS tapes. Like who actually needs that? But I have a book that tells me how to do it.
Right.
So that's how I think of the internet. But I know younger people.
I remember an in-between moment there because I had encyclopedias in my room. I don't know where they came from. My parents must have gotten them at some point.
Your mom was a teacher. Set. She probably had a whole set, right? That makes sense.
Maybe. Who knows? But I had a whole set in my room. I used to read them all the time. They were really interesting. I loved it. But I remember the in-between when it was, what was it? Encarta?
The CD?
The CD. So you had you had a set of encyclopedias on your computer essentially. And I remember that, and it was a lot more information. Sometimes they'd have videos. It was really interesting.
I remember that. That was game changer for me because I'll be very specific. I remember writing a paper in college and having access to one of those and being able to embed in the paper electronically and send it to the professor Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech. Because that was like, I had heard snippets of it. I'd seen it on like the History Channel, but the first time I ever got to see the I Have a Dream speech was in that CD that came from my computer that was in its entirety. And that was like mind-blowing for me.
That might actually be true for me as well.
Because there was no YouTube.
Yeah.
Imagine a life without YouTube. You know, I mean, we didn't have video on demand. We didn't have streaming. We didn't have, there was no place to go to get these videos if you couldn't find a copy of the old tape. And it wasn't a cassette. It wasn't a VHS. It was like reel-to-reel tape because it was news tape, right?
Yeah. What I was
mind blowing.
No, you're fine. I was also going to point out What's interesting, though, is that the difference being that everything that was in an encyclopedia you could find somewhere else. There was no, very rarely, I mean, there's some instances, but very rarely would you find a piece of information only in an encyclopedia.
Yeah, it was just a single gathering point of a lot of data.
Right. So I'm just making the dichotomy difference between we had books in the library and encyclopedias, and now we have books in the library and the internet. And the problem is that everything you needed in the encyclopedias you could find in the library. And the problem is now there's a lot of information in the library, and then there's a lot of other information on the internet, and you now have to, you can't just, what the internet used to be was, like you said, just sort of a place you could reference, and it's now turned into its own resource.
And the other thing about the encyclopedia is a lot of times it would reference where to go get more information, right? Yeah. It would be a Cliff Notes version of, and I'll give you an example. I remember in biology, we were studying the human body for like 3 weeks in biology, and the encyclopedia was enough. And it was really cool because I remember being able to open it up, and it had like these overlays where it had like the body, and then like a clear overlay where it would be like the circulatory system and the tissue and this, and it had like clear pages that it built up. But then I took in my senior year human anatomy and physiology, and where like there were 20 pages in the encyclopedia on it, I had a 800-page textbook on human anatomy and physiology, right? That was a book that was actually referenced in the encyclopedia as a place to go get more info. The internet doesn't go here to go get more info. That's missing. And that was in the encyclopedia. It would reference other stuff.
Yeah.
Because how many times have we had to hunt for the source material when we're doing research?
Yes. And so I made the comment that very rarely is information only in an encyclopedia, and I'm gonna totally change subjects on that point. Matt LaCroix talks about the 1987 New Illustrated Science and Invention Encyclopedia, because in that there's one page that shows the Pioneer 10 craft and Planet X. That dead, like it references a dead star that's 50 billion miles away and a 10th planet. But it's only in this one encyclopedia that it shows up. And so he references it as evidence of a potential cover up, that maybe somebody sent something off before someone went like, oh, we can't tell anybody about this. Oh, it's already in that.
Well, that goes right back to, I'll have to hunt up the name of the book. I think it's like The Right to Life or The Right for Life or something like that. And it's a title that other books have had too, that talk about the DMSO stuff. That book was printed. It was printed privately. Like he didn't go through a big publishing house. The guy who wrote it went and got it published. And back when self-publishing was really, really hard, but it has a Library of Congress number attached to it. But there were only like 1 or 2 printings of it, and then if you didn't get it, you didn't get it. Yeah. And then you don't have it, right? You've got it. That book I found, it's not really a book, but that spiral notebook that I found at the Half Price Books place. The orange one that has all the, I think the little orange spiral one that I found for
with
like
all the weird oddities in it?
Weird oddities that I found for like $5 or $10, and I sent you a picture of it, and you looked it up on eBay, and it was like $250 or something. You're like, buy it right now. But it has stuff that's not anywhere else that we can find without going and finding old books that it's referencing, right?
Right.
And we've gotten way off of mental health, but
no, I know it's all good. Well, since we're off and we're going to wrap here in just a second, I'm going to throw this out here. I probably should save it for another one, but I'm going to throw it out in here. I also just recently read The Case Against the Sexual Revolution by Louise Perry, that I saw on like 4 different podcasts. I heard like multiple people go like, oh, you should really read this. And I will say the same thing. It's really interesting, and gets into sort of the dichotomies of these things of like, has this actually been a good thing? And she makes a lot of arguments that it's really not. It's not been, as far as making things better for women, it's actually put a lot of it's not. And she gets into sexual
I'm going to throw
assault and
I'm going to throw an
consent
anecdotal thing out here because it was in the news today or yesterday, where it was a teacher who was a school teacher who was very attractive, who had done an OnlyFans page, and then found out that she had an OnlyFans page, and I don't know what's in her OnlyFans. I haven't looked it up. Right, I have no idea.
Right.
I don't know if it was sex. I don't know if it was her in bikini pics. I don't know what it is. I don't know if it was her like showing you how to groom a cat. Right, I don't know. But the school fired her because of it. She then got another job, and she made it back in the news because that job found out that she had an OnlyFans page, and it violated their media terms and conditions, and she got fired from the next job.
Yeah.
And I don't think her account is even active anymore. But the fact that one ever existed at all now has cost this person at least 2 jobs, right? And so that is a negative consequence of this potential idea. Now, much like, and to tie it all back into mental health, much like with learning about mental health and how the science has to be done, we won't know probably in our lifetime whether or not the sexual revolution was an overall positive or an overall negative until after we're dead, right? We need past tense hindsight 2020 data on a lot of this stuff. But we should be asking the questions, right?
Well, and there are a lot of podcasts right now that I know you don't pay attention to, but it's something that's on my radar. There's the Whatever podcast, and there's one other one called Fresh and Fit, where there's young people having these discussions about what men expect from women and what women are expecting from men. And, they get into the thing of women expect men to be 6'2" and whatever, and that's an appropriate expectation. And then men say, well, I expect you to not be sleeping with everyone. And well, that's unrealistic. And sort of these back and forths of hang on, the discussion that you get into of when you're dealing with things like sexual assault, where it's awful and horrible and terrible, but there is a level of personal responsibility in some situations of with anything, because you if the world was a perfect place, yes, nothing bad should ever happen to anyone. But people suck. There are some people who are really terrible, and you need to prepare yourself to address that situation if it comes to you. And just like you don't fill your backpack to bursting with cash and go walk through a bad neighborhood. That would be dumb. So you don't do that.
I'm going to take it away from the sexual assault thing because you and I both, let's be very clear, you and I both definitively agree sexual assault in any way is horrible and should never happen, and anyone who does it should be punished to the fullest extent of the law.
And I'm specific. I'm just to clarify. Hang on, to clarify. The reason that I was using that example is because that's what's coming out of the book, and that's the argument that she's approaching,
and it's being talked about in the podcasts and all that stuff.
Right.
But in the same way, where you're talking about personal responsibility, is the same reason that I have a license to carry. And for those people who don't know, that means I took courses, I got extensive background checks done. I went through the whole fingerprinting process so that the state would issue me a license to be able to carry a handgun, concealed or open carry, right? You don't just go and get it. I lived in a state where you showed up and handed them $20 and they handed you a license, and it terrified the hell out of me. But in Texas, where I live, you actually, when I got it, you had to go through all this stuff. I don't carry most of the time. I don't carry all the time. But there are places that if I'm going to go, I do a risk analysis in my head as to, is it safe and do I need an extra level of protection? And I have that thing in my pocket so that I can then carry an extra thing if I need it, right?
Right.
Also, just when you and I decide to go downtown to one of the comedy clubs, we think about where we go, we think about where we park, we think about what route we're going to take, we think about how early we're going to get there. And it's usually when we come out of the show, all right, what's going to be I don't know if you think about it, but I walk out of the comedy clubs and I take a look around and I'm like, what is the safest, most efficient way for us to walk back to where we're parked? because that's just the way, it's risk analysis, and we need to be doing it constantly with everything in our life. But we shouldn't let it rule our life, right?
Right.
We shouldn't be so scared of going outside that we never do.
Right. And the way that you look at it from the other side, and I've talked to plenty of women about this over the years, that, they live their lives in that, looking for exits, and
Mm-hmm.
I think where we sort of butt up against it is, we want it to be better and to
Yes.
not have to live that way and to not have to think about those things. But the problem is that it's always gonna, like, you can't, unless we just start killing those people. Like,
well, here's the problem.
How do you?
Before we could even just kill them all, we have to know they exist.
Right.
And a lot of them are good at hiding it.
Yeah.
Right?
They have to.
You talk about that, like 2 to 4 or whatever percent of people who are like
4 to 5,
actual psycho,
yeah.
sociopathic, whatever.
Right. Yeah.
And
those
a lot
are
of
dangerous percentage.
Well, and a lot of them don't ever actually do anything bad, right? They figure out how to make it work in the world, and then they do it. I think I read somewhere that like 98% of crime is committed by like less than 2% of the population.
That doesn't sound crazy.
It was, and I could be quoting out my butt here and be completely off, but it was a super tiny percentage of the people doing the massive amount of the crime, nonviolent and violent. So,
I heard a story that the guy who created the psychopath test realized that he was one as he was like putting it together. And not to say that he was great, like but he just sort of checked all the boxes and was like, uh-oh, like, wait a minute. And so, but again, this is that thing of, there's a lot of other topics that we won't dive into at this point, but because we should wrap this up. But like, there are bad people in the world. There are people who are going to look to skirt the rules and get away with things and do things they aren't supposed to do. And we all have to be aware of that and take responsibility for ourselves, being aware that there are crazy people out there that are out to get you.
I'm going to sum it up like this: is evil exists, and it acts in the world, and we're never going to be able to get away from that. There's no way to eliminate evil, and however you want to define it, it's going to be there, and as long as it's there, there's going to be bad situations.
So be prepared.
Be prepared. Yeah, and
what a depressing note to end on.
No. I think the note to end on is be holistic in your health. Be holistic in your mental health, and be prepared. Like, if you need to go into therapy, this is how we'll end it. If you need to go into therapy, go in prepared with a goal.